Hi, everyone. Hope this finds everyone doing well today. Do you remember the first time you ever told a lie and got away with it? I do. I think I was about 6 years old. I may have told uh, lies before that, but I remember this one in particular when I did something and I was asked if I knew what happened, if I did it, and I said no, and I blamed it on two of my friends who were completely innocent. Didn't do it at all, but they got spanking. They got belts applied to their rear end because of something I did. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, you can get out of trouble by blaming it on your friends. So thus began my life of crime, lying when it benefited me. All of us are tempted to lie from time to time about things that we've done that we know are wrong, sinful things even. And when we're younger, it's lesser offenses. But when we get older, it becomes more severe. And one of the worst things you can ever happen to you is to lie, and then to think that you got away with it. Think you got away with your sin. Now, years later, I confessed to my two friends that I was actually the one who had done that thing, and they were both shocked. They said, "Yeah, our fathers grabbed us and gave us a spanking. We had no idea why we were being spanked because they hadn't done a thing." But it's actually a very bad thing to lie and to think you've got away with it because actually you haven't. But it teaches you a habit that's hard to break with age. Let's look at King David. King David lied and thought he got away with it. He did get away with it almost, but actually he didn't. And most people who went to Sunday school years ago, who grew up in church, you know about David, the shepherd boy who became king of Israel. And if you're asked, if they were asked to name some well-known stories about David, the first story would almost certainly be David and Goliath. And the second story would likely be David and Bathsheba. The story of David and Bathsheba is well known. The basic plot's been used in many novels and movies. And it's a story about sin. It's a story about the terrible results of sin. Also a story about lying. So in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, we're going to look at this passage, chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, to see about David and his lying, his sins, lying to try and cover up his sins, and what happens. So in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 11, it tells us that King David is supposed to be at war. He's supposed to be leading his people, his army, in a war against the Ammonites, but instead, David stayed home. So we read there in verse 1, chapter 11, 2 Samuel. It said, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Now, at that time, one of the main functions of a king was to be the military leader, military ruler of his people. And so in staying at home, David wasn't behaving as a king should at that time. David was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was dislodged from his position, disengaged from his purpose as a king, and this is a recipe for disaster. Many of our temptations come because we're not where we're supposed to be. We're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And our enemy, Satan, waits until we dislodge ourselves from our position, we disengage from our purpose, and then Satan offers us an alternative. He tempts us. It's always an appeal to the flesh, to our fleshly desires. He can't position us for a fall. We have to do that ourselves. But once we put ourselves in a situation where we can be compromised, he offers us a delightful temptation. Now, this is how the enemy worked in David's life. This is how the enemy works in our lives too. So right after this, in verse 2, we read that it happened. David walked out onto the roof of his palace, and he saw a beautiful woman taking a bath on the roof of her house. And that was how the palaces, the homes were built that time in Jerusalem, flat roofs, so they could take advantage of the cool evening breezes. And the city of Jerusalem was hilly, and David's palace was on one of the hills high up. And as I said, the houses had flat roofs. Later in the afternoon, David was walking on the roof of the palace to enjoy the coolness of the evening, the cool breeze. And as he walked around, he saw a woman bathing. And the author of 2 Samuel emphasizes that she was very beautiful. Now, if David had inadvertently seen her and immediately looked away, that would have been the end of the story. And I think it was Martin Luther who's supposed to have said, "You cannot keep birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from building a nest in your hair." And so the enemy knew that beautiful women were one of David's weak spots, his Achilles heel, so to speak. And so David, he didn't look away. He kept on looking at this beautiful woman taking a bath. Now, do you know what your weak spot is? I assure you the enemy does. And once we dislodge ourselves from our relational position in life as a husband or a wife, father, mother, friend, truth teller, a follower of Jesus, once we dislodge ourselves from that, then the enemy serves up an appetizer that our flesh craves. So David was captivated by this beautiful woman. We know that to be the case because in verse 3, we read that David sent and inquired about the woman. He wanted to know more about this beautiful woman, who she was. And so the servant went, made some inquiries, and came back and told David, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Now, as soon as David heard that she was married, he should have just stopped pursuing her right there, stopped even thinking about her. Because David himself was already married. In fact, he had several wives. So Bathsheba was married, but that boundary didn't stop David. He sent for her, and he slept with her. He had a one-night stand with her, and then he sends her home. Well, what happens next? Well, we know what happens next because verse 5 tells us that Sheba conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." Now what do? The fun is over. And she has a message for you. "I'm pregnant." Now what? Famous Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias would oftentimes say, "Sin will take you further than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, cost you more than you would ever want to pay." So sin, takes you further, keeps you longer, costs you more than you ever want to pay. And sadly, we know now, Ravi Zacchaeus knew this personally because he was living this story in his life. After he died last year, many of those who worked with him in his ministry revealed that he has sexually abused countless women and committed adultery on a regular basis for many, many years. It was covered up, it was hushed up, so as not to ruin his ministry and those who were involved in the ministry with him. They were complicit in covering it up. But after he died, the truth came out. So in our story about David and Bathsheba, sin has taken David further than he wants to go. Now, David comes up with a plan. Okay, Bathsheba is conceived, she's pregnant, but her husband is away with the army fighting the Ammonites. And so David thinks, I better get Uriah, the husband, back home. So he sends a message to Joab saying, "Send Uriah the Hittite back to Jerusalem." Now, you might have a bit of hope for King David, thinking, well, he's asking Joab to send Uriah back to Jerusalem so that he can confess to Uriah what he's done. "I've slept with your wife. Now she's pregnant." So here's David's moment to continue as a man after God's own heart, to be honest, to confess his sin. Instead, when Uriah the Hittite arrives and comes to David, David inquires, from him, ask him about, you know, how's the battle going? How's General Joab? How are the soldiers doing? How's the war proceeding? And then after Uriah tells him, David tells Uriah to go home and relax for a day or two. Spend a couple days at home with Uriah. And David actually sends a gift to Uriah's house to show how much he appreciates him as one of his soldiers. So David is trying to use money, trying to bribe his way out of the problem. And whenever we use money to cover up sin, it always makes things worse in the end. Once we have sinned and we don't immediately confess, sin encourages us to avoid the truth by covering up the truth, by telling more lies. Like David, when we don't immediately confess sin, we create shadows, try and create shadows that appear to be true. So instead of confessing what he had done to Uriah, David created a scenario where Uriah was to go home and sleep with his wife. So David wanted to let an innocent man believe that he had conceived a child. And he was going to expect Bathsheba to go along with this lie, to live a lie with her husband. So David shows by his actions that he's only thinking about himself. He only cares about himself. And so, trying to cover things up like this, it makes us myopic. And what is myopia? Well, it's a condition of your eyesight where you're nearsighted. You can't see things clearly far away. And so unconfessed sin makes us myopic, makes us nearsighted to the consequences of our sin because of our judgment. And our judgment gets worse with time. The more we don't confess our sin, the more that we try and cover it up. So David's judgment worsens. He tries to get Uriah to sleep with his wife so he will think that the child conceived is his. But Uriah doesn't do that. He doesn't go home. He didn't think it was right for him to be back in Jerusalem, back relaxing at his home with his wife when his fellow soldiers are still out on the battlefield. And so instead of going home, David sleeps outside the entrance of David's palace with the other servants. When David finds out about this, he's shocked. And he calls for Uriah and asks, "Why didn't you go home like I told you to?" Uriah's answer to David tells us a lot about him, about the man Uriah. As Uriah said, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents. My master Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." So Uriah expresses solidarity with his comrades and shows that he is acting honorably. And he mentions the fact that the Ark of the Covenant is there with the army in a tent with the soldiers. And so the presence of the Ark says that this is actually an example of a holy war, that God is with them in this battle. And in fighting such a war, the Torah says that the men were to consecrate themselves entirely to Yahweh, entirely to God, and entirely to the battle at hand. The men were not to sleep with their wives. So Uriah, a Hittite, not a native Israelite, was far more scrupulous in adhering to the law of Moses than was King David. So there's something of a rebuke for David in what Uriah says to him. He's actually saying, "David, you should be out on the battlefield. You should be out there with your men sleeping in tents, not laying around the palace." Well, David becomes more desperate when he heard what Uriah said. And he tells Uriah, "Well, remain for a few more days before going back to battle." And David wants a few more days to come up with a better plan and a better lie. Unconfessed sin makes better liars of us with time. So because David refused to confess his sin, he's now going to step off into a world he probably never dreamed he would enter. His next step is to try to get Uriah drunk so that he will sleep with his wife. So David is now trying to influence others to sin, to cover up his sin. But David's plan didn't work. God didn't allow it. Uriah refused to go home. He refused, even though he was drunk. David did get him drunk. But even drunk, he refused to go home and sleep with his wife. Uriah was a better man drunk than King David was sober. So here's another chance for David to confess his sin. After Uriah, even though he gets drunk, won't go home, sleep with his wife, David could have confessed to him what happened. But instead, he comes up with a plan to have Uriah murdered. Okay, he sends a letter to Joab, the general, to put Uriah in the front of the army where the fighting is the fiercest, and then at the height of the battle to withdraw the soldiers from around Uriah so that he will be killed. So when Uriah goes back to the battlefield, he's carrying this letter of instructions from David to Joab on a plan to have him killed, murdered. Now, this is one of the most notorious acts of treachery in the Old Testament. And that's saying something if you read the Old Testament. Okay? What makes this event so despicable is that Uriah wasn't just any soldier. He was one of David's mighty men, his special military force, one of his best soldiers. They were known as the 30 chiefs who had been with David since the days of Adullam's cave, as we read in 2 Samuel chapter 23, where Uriah's name is mentioned as one of the mighty men, one of the 30 chiefs. In other words, Uriah was a trusty companion of David's from long back. He was probably David's friend. And David ordered to have him killed. And that's what happened. Joab followed David's instructions, and Uriah was killed in the next battle. So David had convinced himself that what he was doing was for the best interest of everyone. David tried to justify what he was doing in his letter to Joab, telling Joab not to be overly worried or concerned about this. So sin had taken David further than he would ever imagine that he could have gone. But once Uriah is dead, David brought Bathsheba to his house, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. So David is now living a lie as if it were the truth. And so we think, well, the end of the story is, and they lived happily ever after, right? No, not even close. 2 Samuel 11 verse 27 says that the thing David had done displeased the Lord. And that's putting it very mildly. God was very angry with David over what he had done. And this is the final effect of unconfessed sin. When you try and cover it up, it makes God angry about the sin that you have committed. To sin is human, but to cover it up is evil. I think that's what displeased God so much. Not so much that David had sinned, but that he refused to confess it, and he was trying to cover it up, and even went to the point of murdering a good friend to cover up his sin. God does not forgive unconfessed sin. If we don't expose sin, if we don't admit it and confess it, then it starts eating at our hearts. And our hearts are supposed to be committed to God. But unconfessed sin will eat at our hearts like bacteria eats at one's flesh. Even the world knows that trying to hide these things is not good, that it eats away at you. So how about Christians, who follow Jesus? Do we know that? Do we really know that? Do we know that unconfessed sin can really eat away at us and destroy our hearts? Well, David thought he got away with his lies and his sin against Bathsheba and against her husband Uriah. He thought that he got away with his sin against God, but he didn't. Of course he didn't. Now we read in the next chapter, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, that the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to confront David about his sin. And so Nathan does it in a very, very clever way. Nathan comes to David and he says, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you something that's happened. So there were two men One is a rich landowner. He owned a lot of sheep and cattle. And the other was a poor man who only owned one sheep, but he loved that sheep very much. And so one day, a friend of the rich landowner comes to visit. In those days, it was required to offer hospitality, especially to a friend. It was required to offer them a meal, a place to stay. So instead of taking a lamb from his own flock, the rich man stole the poor man's only sheep, killed it, had it cooked, put it on the table for his friend. Now David is listening to this, and he's getting caught up in this story. And he gets very angry about the injustice of this. You see David's real heart coming through here. He said that the man who did this rich man who did that to the poor man, he must die. And probably one of the most moving scenes of the Old Testament, Nathan looks David in the eye and says, "You are that man." Read in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7. You are that man. You are that rich man. This is what you've done to Uriah. And the shock as he realized that his sin was known must have been incredible for David. It's always a shock when we think that the sin that we have hidden so well is exposed, that people know about it. So what does David do? Well, instead of having the prophet Nathan put into prison or perhaps executed, like many of the later kings did when prophets came to tell them unwanted news, David confesses his sin to Nathan. He says, 2 Samuel 12, verse 13, "I have sinned against the Lord." And then he confesses it publicly. Psalm 51. To read Psalm 51 is David's confession of his sin, and David begging God to have mercy on him, to forgive him, and cleanse him of his sin. And this is one of the reasons I think that David is called a man after God's own heart. It took a while. It took further sins, but David stopped lying. He stopped trying to cover up his sin. He confessed his sin to God and to man, and he begged for God's forgiveness and cleansing. And that is genuine repentance. And that is a heart that God desires that we all have. The Apostle John says this in his first letter in 1 John chapter 1, verses 8 to 10. John says, "But if we say we have no sin, we are only fooling ourselves and refusing to accept the truth." That's what David tried to do for a while. John goes on to say, "But if we confess our sins to him," to God, "he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and cleanse us from every wrong." So the point of this story, of what I'm saying today, is don't let sin take you further down the dark hole of its effects. Don't let unconfessed sin eat away at your heart that truly must belong to God, be dedicated to God. Confess it. Forsake it today. Stop lying about it, lying to yourself, lying to others, trying to lie to God about it. God is faithful to his word. He will forgive you, and he will cleanse you of the wrong that you did.